Okay, well, welcome everybody to today's panel discussion. This is the third day of Manchester in Translation, which is Common Press's conference for people, for anyone thinking about or starting their careers in a literary translation. Today's panel discussion is found in translation and is all about translation as an autonomous, separate, independent, creative practice, and how it sits beside and informs translators' own creative writing. We're joined today by three guests who are both translators and also authors themselves, Saskia Vogel, Meena Kandasamy, and Jen Kalea. My name is Rob Page, I'm the founder of Common Press. I'll just introduce each three of the guests, and then I'll ask them all sort of individual questions. And if anybody online wants to ask questions in the chat, please just put your questions in the chat and we'll put them to the authors. First of all, Saskia Vogel is an author and translator from the Swedish, originally from Los Angeles, now living in Berlin. Her debut novel, Permission, about love, loss and BDSM, was published in 5 languages. She was awarded the 2021 Berlin Senate Grant for non-German language literature and was a PEN America Translation Award finalist for her translation of Jessica Schiefaur's Girls Lost. Her forthcoming translation of Aednan by the Sami-Swedish author Linnea Axelsson is the focus of her work as Princeton University's forthcoming translator in residence. Recent translations include Johanne, Lykke, Holm's, Strega, Karolina, Ramqvist, Bear Woman, and Steve Sem-Sandberg's W. She's previously worked as Granta magazine's global publicist and as an editor on the AVN Media Network. We're also joined by Meena Kandasamy, who is an anti-caste activist, poet, novelist, and translator, translating from the Tamil. As a translator, she has translated speeches and essays of Dravidian ideologue Periyar E.V. Ramasamy and the Dalit leader Thol Thiruma Valavan on caste annihilation, women's liberation, and social justice. She has also translated the poetry of Tamil guerrillas and contemporary feminists. Her translation of Tamil novelist Salma as Women Dreaming won the PEN Translates Award, and her feminist translation of the Book of Desire from the Thirukural is forthcoming. And finally, we have Jen Kalea. Jen is a writer, literary translator from the German and a publisher. Her recent publications include her own short story collection, I'm Afraid That's All We Have Time For, and the pamphlet essay Goblins. Her writing has appeared in, her fiction has appeared in Best British Short Stories 2021, the White Review, Ambit, London Magazine and elsewhere. And she writes a column on translation for the Brixton Review of Books. Jen was the inaugural translator in residence at the British Library and was shortlisted for the Man Booker International Prize in 2019 and the Schlegel Tieck Prize in 2018 for her translations from the German. Alongside Kat Starasi, Jen is co-publisher of Pressbar Press, a micropress for Maltese literature in English and in English translation. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to start, obviously today's discussion is around how being a creative writer in your own right informs and is informed by your work as translators. So I'm going to start firstly with you, Saskia. You said recently in a conversation in Granta magazine that you've been writing your own prose fiction for 2 decades before taking up translation in 2013, and you were quite surprised by how your writing then became shaped by your translation work and how it was influenced by Swedish. Can you talk a little bit more about that and expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh gosh, you know, hearing you say that I was writing for 2 decades just reminds me of like how much time I feel like my voice and confidence needed to develop as a writer. And I think that also, and I think it relates in a bit to influence as does the practice of translation, because I think early in my writing career when I was trying to find my voice and trying to like, I don't know, just get like the jazz of my own writing together. I remember like really needing to slough off, say, like a certain academic tone that I had fallen very much in love with as an undergraduate. my various fascinations for a while. Like for a while, I was just obsessed with like magazine articles, and so my voice morphed then. And I would say that, you know, in those 3 years when I was working as a publicist at Granta and getting to read, or reading in a very different way, something shifted and broke open, and something that felt more like mine emerged as a voice. And then when I started translating, one of the things I really love about translation is seeing how far we can push the boundaries of the English language. And so I think, just like academia or my other interests had influenced my writing previously, I think reading Swedish books so closely and trying to write them in English impacted my style as well, because I was actively practicing, I guess, like a prose style that can hold a lot of silence. There's like a really special kind of silence that I think is written into Swedish texts, or that Swedish can hold as a language. And then also, what's one more example? Silence and ambiguity. Like I think there's a special way that ambiguity is treated in Swedish. I think maybe because there's a higher tolerance in the reading culture for letting things sort of waft past each other and to make sort of glancing connections. And also just in terms of how Swedish prose in general has, there's a, I don't know, people break apart sentences a lot, you know, like the use of punctuation, I think, is different. And so there are kind of different rhythmic possibilities opened up. And I started working that into my own prose, I guess, because that aha moment where I felt like my writing started to become mine and translation happened at about the same time, or like within a year or two of each other.
It's very interesting you use the phrase tolerances, because every language has a different set of tolerances. Every language seems to be, or the literature of that language seems to be much more tolerant of certain things, which English, I know, certainly isn't. And it's a very strange process working in, from my point of view, working as an editor who doesn't speak the original languages, editing the English translations. Just that you just pick up on certain patterns and certain tolerances, culture by culture. Jen, your kind of experience is similar in that you say when you started speaking German, it forced you to simplify your sentences and simplify your language, and that in turn has influenced your prose and poetry. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think because I was thinking about this leading up to the panel, and I think, what happened for me was definitely going through that process of learning German. So I'd done a bit of German at school, but then moved to Germany when I was 18 for 18 months and discovered very quickly that I actually knew no German, that I hadn't really learned much at all, and experienced that kind of kindness from German speakers, whereby they would recognize that maybe my German skills weren't all that good yet, and they would speak to me in a very kind of stripped down way, you know, avoiding any kind of embellishment that might throw me off. And I felt this to be quite a kind mechanism, that, you know, that people would go to the effort of speaking in a more straightforward German so that I'd be able to follow the conversation, and then they would allow me that time to respond back to them in my very interesting young German. And obviously my German is a lot better now, and I ended up kind of teaching myself advanced German from reading a lot of German literature and then kind of learning on the job as a translator. So with every translation I've done, every book I've translated, or every project, I feel like it's given me another level and layer to my German skills. And I think it made me think a lot about those early days, how to get to the core of communicating. You know, when you don't have very high language skills in a new language, you're kind of stringing together what you need out of the few words that you have, or the few phrases you have, to be able to get your message across and to communicate. So you have to, you don't have the luxury of drawing on a whole wealth of a whole language. And so that really affected my prose, in that I started thinking about that as well. I've been in a phase of writing in very straightforward prose as a response to that. And maybe it's changing now, but it made me really think about writing very archetypally, very simply, very stripped down, so that maybe everyone could access the story in its most basic parts. And that's not to say I'm against any kind of complicated or oblique writing. I think that's incredibly necessary to have specificity and complexity, and that's why I also write poetry and believe in poetry as a form. But there was a second thing I was thinking about, and that I think that reflex and interest in simplicity started maybe with my parents, and I think it's a kind of intergenerational communication thing. It's a class thing. Thinking back to, you know, my parents left school very early, and then I went into further education, higher education, and suddenly it seemed like I was speaking a different language to them because of what I had experienced through going through education. But also with them, you know, they went to catering college, and my dad was a mechanic, and they would simplify what they did so I would understand what they did, and I was doing the same. So I call it this kind of like tender paraphrasing, where it's a form of translation where you're kind of removing the complexity of something to get to the core of it, so that you can meet in the middle and understand one another. And I think that's what I'm also interested with translation itself, you know, how I've been striving for years to try and find that very simplified way of explaining what translation is, not to remove the complexity of it, but to open a door for people that have no comprehension at all of what translation is. So I'm always wondering, how can I find the perfect metaphor or find the perfect tender paraphrase to explain what translation is? So yeah.
Is there a kind of a sense of obligation to after you break things down and simplify things into English, to then build them up and sort of dress them up and recomplicate them? Do you find that's an obligation that you have to resist, or a tendency, or do you feel pressured to kind of sophisticate the language again?
Do you mean in translation?
Yeah,
or...
yeah.
Yeah, I think with translation, my kind of first and primary motivation is this, you know, getting down what I read in that first draft very, very quickly. You know, what is it that comes to mind immediately when I read that German sentence? Well, you know, is it the image? Is it what it's communicating in a very fundamental sense? And that's really exciting, because it's still very miraculous to me that suddenly you can write an English sentence that encapsulates a German sentence. And then it's in the redrafting and the re-editing where you realize you need to build an extension on that sentence, or you need to scrape away some of what you have to then refine it into its perfect form. And sometimes it goes through many different iterations. But in the first instance, being led by that impulse of letting it speak to me and writing down what comes to mind first of all, this kind of subconscious translation before the really conscious refining.
Thanks. Mina, you write in Tamil, in English, and you translate from Tamil into English. I wonder, how does your voice change as you go from one language to another? Do you feel that your voice changes?
I have something very interesting to share, actually, which is that before I was a published writer, I was a translator, and I was doing a lot of political translations. So they were like prose or speech, but a lot of the prose was very polemic, very political, almost propagandist in terms of, you know, the kind of issues that it took up, which is issues of caste annihilation or women's liberation. And but I also I think when Saskia told me she was writing for the last 2 decades, it's something very similar, because when I was translating books, I was about 17 or 18 years old, and a lot of people, I have written about this, I think, for Writers Mosaic, which is a kind of a UK-run website where writers come and share their experiences. And one of the things that I really wanted to share at that time, and which I still really want to share, is that because I was so young and I was a translator, a lot of well-meaning people would come and tell me, you have to step out of the shadow. You cannot be a translator all your life, that you have to have your own identity. And that's because 20 years ago, a translator was not seen so critical to literature. They were not seen at, the center of the debate around literature. And there was always the danger, I think, from other people's eyes, that if you became a translator, you would just be somebody's shadow, like you'd just be swept away. So when I also started writing my own stuff, earlier it was poetry, and later I was doing novels and nonfiction. I really strived to make sure that my writing would not in any way sound like, Periyar. It should not in any way sound like the feminist poet I was translating, that, it had to be my own. Because otherwise people would say, oh, she exactly sounds the same as when she translates somebody else. So as much as, you had to invent the English for Periyar, or invents the English version for Tiruma, or the voice of, the other poets you translate, you also have to invent yourself in English. And that's because Tamil is my first language. I don't write much in Tamil, but my English is only my second language. So for me, I had to also translate myself, so when I write in English, I had to make sure that I was not writing the way my authors were writing. And so this was an early struggle. And then later on, it also, I had the exact opposite experience, which I also think is quite interesting to share, which is at this point, this whole fear, and this is something that I'm sure younger translators would understand, or have to cope with, especially if you're a writer translator. Like, where does your writer self begin, and where does your translator self end? And how do people look at influences? Because sometimes it's so important to prove yourself as an individual voice, as a distinctive voice, as a stylistic voice. You should have your own aesthetics. I think it's really really important. So I was on the one hand striving to do that, and then for a period of time, around 8 or 9 years, I didn't do much translation. I completely left it there, and I was writing the fiction that I wanted to write. So I was writing my own novels, and I wrote at least 3 in quick succession before I came back to translating and then managing my writing also. And then the interesting thing was, because I got all my translations until that point had been published only in India, but then I started publishing in the UK, and I think, what, at least for me, it was a lot of immense amount of recognition. And then when people came to me with translations, they started saying things like, oh, we just need you to translate this book, but when we read this, we want to be as if Meena Kandasamy wrote this book. And at that time, I was just the same person who was going back and telling them, no, we don't make, just as we don't make, the translator writer into somebody who sounds like the text they're translating, we also don't make the writer into somebody who puts everybody sound just like them when they bring them into English. I said, if I'm going to translate Salma is going to sound like Salma when she comes in English. She's not going to sound like me when she comes in English. We just because you're putting them into another language, we can't rob their individuality, their originality, their authority. And this was not an easy conversation to have, because people would just assume, oh, she's so lazy, or she thinks styles are so different, or whatever it is that people think. But I was really insistent on this, and I just wanted to share that with you.
No, thank you. It's something that you hear translators say a lot. Daniel Hahn, most people will know, gave a keynote speech at this conference a couple of years ago, and he talked about the way in which the translator has to be a chameleon, has to be many, many different voices and many, many different types of writer, throughout their career. And it's not about having a voice as a translator. It's about finding many other voices. I was also very interested in what you were saying about the way that the role of the translator is regarded as in the shadow of the writer. We heard yesterday from another translator, Ali Reza Abiz from Tehran, from Iran, who spoke about the fact that in Iran, the translator is actually viewed as kind of more prestigious than contemporary writers. I just wondered how what your experiences were going from being a writer to a translator, or the other way around. How do you feel that suddenly as a writer you're much more respected, or as a translator you're kind of a subordinate, or has that imbalance sort of been addressed, and is it improving?
Well, there's not a lot of I can't speak for everyone, but from Tamil to English, those who translate only, most of them only do translations. They don't write themselves, or they've not established themselves like in a serious, they've not chosen writing as a career, so they would just be translators. But I do think that there is a huge resentment among Tamil people, for instance, or especially the Tamil literary community, on people who write only in English. And this has a lot to do with, the fact that the larger, broader Indian media only highlights people who write in English, or that, they are easily received in the West. And these kind of things existed very strongly like 10 or 15 or even 20 years ago. And even last week, I had a call from a Tamil writer whom I respect a lot. And, he was congratulating me for something. And then he made this tongue-in-cheek remark to say, "Oh, I'm just a simple man who writes in Tamil. I'm not an English writer like you." So there is definitely this kind of feeling. But on the other hand, Tamil is read by 80 million people. So there's no way that, there's no way not to feel proud about it. It's immense. And on the other hand, because you're not only a writer, but because you're a translator, you're seen with immense amount of respect, because I think writers understand the role that you're playing in terms of enabling a type of a reception and getting them larger readerships in places that are far flung as well, or different. But also, I think for a lot of writers, and I say this with a lot of earnestness, there's only a couple of writers, for instance, whose work I have translated, who are only into creative writing, because most of the work that I have done are political text. So when I do the writing, it's not about somebody getting famous or somebody getting paid space, but it's about a certain type of discourse that enters another type of space. So for instance, in Tamil Nadu, there is a certain progressive, rational, as well as a long history of anti-caste discourse, or there's a certain, a feminist movement that goes back to the 1920s. So there are things that when you put this into English, you're really translating not like the text, or not, it's not about publicizing an author, it's about bringing this into as a kind of an oppositional discourse to what is the mainstream discourse, because the mainstream, or what I would rather even call the hegemonic discourse, because today the hegemonic discourse is the idea that women's clothes have to be dictated by the state, or the discourse that we are a Hindu fundamentalist country, or the fact that if you're what constitutes a good Hindu, or why is the caste system good. So there's a certain the oppressive forces have their own discourse. So when you actually translate a text that speaks against this discourse, then I think what you're doing is, creating a debate, you're creating something in the public sphere of, articulation. So for me, it's not just a question of deception, it's a question of what do you do as a translator? Like, do you, just because I write in English, do I just continue to write in English and say what I have to say? Or do I actually, do I present this other discourse that's happening, this very lively discourse that's happening in one part of the country, which the rest of the country needs to hear, or, needs to understand, try to find, their variant, or try to contribute to it. So I think that's a more important role that I see for myself as a translator. I think the idea of prestige or fame or money, I think all of that is really in some way will not be relevant after I'm gone, but the work that you do in terms of this political liaison, or whatever it is you may call it, I think that is more important.
Thank you, absolutely. This question of sort of themes and context that you're kind of translating from leads me to my next question, really, which was going to be about how, as with one hat on as a writer and with another hat on as a translator, how themes are affected or influenced in your own work as a writer. I guess I was going to start with you, Saskia, because obviously you write around you engage with taboos and power structures and kind of hidden motivations in your work, and I wonder how translating and reading a lot of Swedish work, has that influenced you, because the way in which those themes are kind of are regarded in that culture, has reading a lot of and translating a lot of Swedish fiction affected the way in which you engage with those particular themes in your own writing?
A bit. I'm remembering a really difficult conversation I had on stage about patriarchy and BDSM and violence in Stockholm, where I was reminded that just because a big conversation and seemingly a lot of movement and progress had been made in terms of acknowledging a wider spectrum of identity in terms of sexuality, just because that conversation took place and seemed to have gained a lot of traction, say, in the Anglosphere, or maybe more specifically, the United States in the 90s, doesn't mean that the same conversation isn't going to happen, I guess, again, in the United States, or even in a country that, for example, is Sweden, is kind of has the international perception of being so very egalitarian and stuff. And I guess, my book coming out in the midst of kind of a renewed debate that felt very 90s retro to me from an American perspective was a fresh debate in Sweden. And I guess it reminded me to, I don't know, it reminds me to always look beyond the borders of where I'm writing from. So I suppose, yeah, just the fact of being a translator, and maybe also living in yet another foreign country. I lived in the UK for a long time. I'm always reminded of kind of the wider debate in which my themes are contextualized, because I suppose it impacts how I want to face the world as a writer. You know, like the next book that I'm working on is kind of rooted in the United States. It's nonfiction, but I really want to write it in a way that opens out onto the world and is sort of, as opposed to like, hey, this is an American book for an American reader. Yeah, and I mean, I suppose to your previous question, which I thought was really nice, and I guess dovetails with this one. With Swedish, I feel like I've become someone who actually reads into sort of a canon or like a body of work that is constantly evolving, like contemporary Swedish literature, or digging into sort of my more niche interests in the past, like with modernist writing, for example. But with my own work, I feel like I always feel very underread, because my interests are so specific that like I'm more likely to have read like this self-published pamphlet from, you know, by a sort of Twitter scholar who's also a sex worker than I am to have read like Hilary Mantel. So I feel, you know, I feel more up to date, I suppose, in terms of my reading in Swedish and how that evolves. And I really enjoy kind of building on what Mina was saying. I really take great pride in this role I have as kind of a medium for stories that, you know, feel like they need to be brought across borders. Absolutely.
Jen, you write in you talk about the fact you write poetry as well as prose fiction and prose, and I just wondered how, if your multilingualism kind of influenced those different forms in different ways. If you know, perhaps say your poetry is more influenced by your multilingualism, by your other languages than your prose, or the other way around, or is it not as simple as that?
It's a good question, because for a long time I wouldn't describe myself as being multilingual. I think because I definitely don't describe myself as being bilingual with English and German, because I don't feel like I don't communicate in German the same way that I communicate in English. And it's only more recently that I've been engaging with a language that I feel like should have been mine but wasn't, which is Maltese. So I feel like I should have had a multilingual upbringing, because my dad is Maltese and speaks 4 languages. But when he came to the UK and met my mother, you know, we became a monolingual family, because my mum is Irish, English Irish, and so it's only more recently where I've been realizing that I feel like I've always had a multilingual personality, but that it took a long time to develop, both by going in the direction of German, and now I'm like formally studying Maltese as a language. And for a long time, maybe thematically, translation and German would come up in my work. So, you know, I'd have German characters, or I'd have characters that went to Germany and learned German and became very German, way more German than I could ever be, because I haven't lived there long enough. So it's almost like living out the fantasy of what I maybe could have become if I'd stayed in Germany longer. But now actually I am adding and inserting German and Maltese into my work, thinking, you know, about what that does to have a multilingual text and how important it is, and realizing how much I love reading multilingual texts, you know, with both you know, German language writers who write in a mixture of German and English, or insert English into their German text, but also multilingual writers that write in languages that I don't understand. I feel like it's more representative of a real self. And, you know, we talk a lot about how actually multilingualism and the multilingual self is the norm globally, whereas we forget about that in the UK, being kind of a monoculture, and that being the dominant story of the UK often, that, you know, that we're a monolingual country, which is just not the case anyway. So I've become more and more excited by becoming a multilingual writer. And I think multilingualism and translation have become the dominant themes in my writing. So at the moment I'm writing 2 novels and a translator memoir, and the novels both engage with translation very deeply. One is about a fictional country where no one outside of that place knows the language, and there's kind of mistranslations both of that place but also of the literatures and the texts of that country. And then also the second novel is looking at audio description, which is the description of visual materials for blind and visually impaired people. So the lead character is an audio describer, and it's looking at whether they made a really big mistake in one of the audio descriptions. And then the translator memoir is me trying to communicate through the prism of my life what translation is. So you could say I'm kind of obsessed with multilingualism and translation, and maybe it won't always be that case, but I'm just really riding that wave and really enjoying learning Maltese, publishing Maltese writers with the small press I do of Cat Starace, again writers who are multilingual that write multilingual texts across Maltese and English. So it's, you know, that when Mina's talking about where does the author translator author self kind of end, I have no idea anymore where that ending is. I just feel like I inhabit this this kind of translator personality all the time at the moment.
It's very interesting, this what you're saying about multilingualism being the norm in other parts of the world, but not in the West, or not in the UK certainly. It's also to a degree a certain type of multilingualism is valued and other types are not. For instance, when Boris Johnson famously gave a speech entirely in Latin at I think it was the Take Britain exhibition or the British Museum, the journalists were utterly in awe, and every time he cites anything in Latin, everybody's, you know, falling over themselves and their jaws are on the floor. But the 9-year-old boy who lives across the street from me, Pakistani boy, who can cite just as long passages from the Quran in his third language, you know, there's nothing special about that, and he doesn't get journalists, you know, clapping and cheering and whooping for his multilingualism. It's a certain type of multilingualism which seems to be you know, respected here, and other types, you know, familial multilingualism is not at all. I guess, and another question I wanted to ask you specifically, Mina, was you translate a lot of political text, or you have done, as you say, and I wondered how you separated your own voice in your own writing from, you talked a little bit about that, but how do you separate your own voice from the voices of all of those kind of political contexts that you've worked with in the past?
No, I think it's a question of theme and voice. You know, earlier we were discussing this question of themes as well with Saskia and what Jen and what they choose. So in terms of theme, I think I really my themes are very closely linked to those who translate, because I translate them because they stand for what I think is what we should stand for at this moment, you know, like in Indian history. So, you know, the question of caste is a major question. So a lot of my translations circle around the question of caste. They circle around the question of women's liberation, because again, you know, a lot of the texts that I've translated happen to be dealing with feminist questions and burning questions. And the third question is again the question of you know, what you call, you know, the word nationalism is very taboo when you say it in Europe, but a kind of ethnic, national, or linguistic identity. Like, what does it mean to be a Tamil, and what does it mean to be a Tamil in the face of oppression? What does it mean to be? So I think that there is a complete overlap in terms of theme of who I translate and what, but in terms of the writing, I think that the political texts are speeches made before tens of thousands of people, or they happen to be the work of somebody who must have spent 2, 3, or 10, or I don't know, not 10, but, you know, 5 or 6 decades of their life organizing people. So I think that comes from a very different place than somebody like me who would, you know, like, well, I do a lot of fiction and poetry, but sometimes I do reportage from the ground. So I think the form dictates what you write. Like, you know, I don't do the same forms. I've never stood before tens of thousands of people and given a rally rousing speech asking people to do something, you know what I mean? On the other hand, I would go to visit an atrocity zone and write from on the ground as a reporter. So I think the form that I choose make sure that my tone is not the same tone as somebody who is, let's say, a mass leader or an organizer or an ideologue. So I definitely think that there's no overlap, but definitely in terms of themes, I think they are really, really interlinked.
Thank you. There's been a couple of questions from the audience. The first is about translating your own work. Do any of you translate your own work, and or do you have any strong feelings about whether you should translate your own work? Saskia?
Oh, go ahead, Mina.
Oh, no, please, Saskia, go ahead. No, I don't have anything important.
Oh, yeah, no, mine is also just a trifle. I tried translating a short story of mine once, and I didn't have a lot of time to do it because I wanted to submit it to something in Sweden, and I had, like, you know, as it always is, I was like, oh, the deadline's like in 2 days. And it's interesting to look back at that and just understand, I guess it was like reverse engineering the mechanisms of an automatic translation. Like, it was kind of really exciting to see how spectacularly I had failed to render the Swedish, and also how my ideas of what Swedish sounds like came out in this first draft of a translation. And when I look at it in relation to, say, I don't know, into another Swedish text, or into just thinking about the body of text that I work with, it's, I don't know, it was sort of like a strange pantomime of Swedish, and that felt really strange. But I do slowly, I've started to write in Swedish, and there I really relate to what Jen was speaking about in terms of simplification. I wrote a little foreword for a poet I really love, a modernist poet called Ruth Hillarp. And I wrote a little foreword for her poetry collection in Sweden. And I noticed, I don't know, the feeling of writing was so different, because I wanted to make myself understood. didn't want to make a mess of things. I was worried that I'd like start writing and then I'd drive the editor crazy by discovering that my Swedish is in fact awful or something. And I just painstakingly wrote a very simple kind of introduction, even down to sort of the sentence structure, which was an interesting, I don't know, it was an interesting experience to feel myself writing in a different way. I really loved having my novel translated by Johanne Lykke Holm, and I've since translated her novel Strega, which is coming out, I think, this year. And because I felt such a strong connection with her prose that I feel like if I don't know, I feel like there's a special kind of like, there's like a magical quality when I look at our texts all in a row, my book, her translation of my book, her book, my translation of her book. There's a really interesting flow, I suppose, in terms of, I don't know, where there are overlaps, not just in the style, but also our concerns as writers. I don't know, there's like a beautiful sense of continuum, and yeah.
Thank you. There was another question, which goes back to the issue of tolerances that you brought up, Saskia, at the beginning. I was just asking how, what approach do you take when you're translating from a language which tolerates one thing into another language that doesn't tolerate that thing? The example that was given in French, the person that's asked the question, of French descriptive writing is much more tolerated than in English. There isn't much time for description. It's, you have to put the action first, yeah. So how do you go about things like tolerances and intolerances?
I'm on the side of the writer and the integrity of the text. However, and so I'm always in the writer's corner with a strong awareness of, like, I feel like it is also then like a big part of my job to understand or to anticipate editorial queries. And so I'm actually working on a text right now where it's very ambiguous and flowing. There's kind of almost a constant present tense, even though we're dealing with like several layers of memory and time and place. And yeah, as I'm translating this text, I'm just like in an early draft process. So like, I feel like I'm still too focused on the details to see the whole picture yet. But my intuition is telling me, we keep on referring to rivers. At some point, I think to root this text, really, I think maybe we need to mention the name of the river once. And so they're like, and I just before this event, actually, I was discussing this with the writer, and in this particular text, she imagines that if it feels necessary when I get to that stage, when I get to a later stage in the translation, to add subtle clarifications or landmarks or something, that is okay. I noticed that it's easier to play with these ambiguities and these tolerances in fiction. When I've translated nonfiction, I noticed that there's a much bigger editorial imperative, it seems, from editors, from English-speaking publishers, to like conform to a certain type of nonfiction, which which meant I went through a really intense edit where I was reminded of just how much I stand on the side of the author. Nothing bad happened in terms of like, I don't think the book has been compromised in any way. I think it's a beautiful book, but it was just interesting to see the questions that came up and where like the Swedish will tend towards like just letting meaning waft, like not pinning meaning down, letting something be broken open, like a sort of Verfremdungseffect with familiar tropes, and letting the reader feel distant from, say, a concept about social media that we might just say, like, we might say Instagram, but the writer really wanted to just write, the video sharing of image sharing network, like moments where there's like the text feels unsettling. Yeah, I had to be really aware of like when it seemed appropriate to make a change, or when really let's sit with a text that maybe doesn't sit uncomfortably, but like, yeah, bumps up against one of those tolerances. I think as translators, we're also shaping the reading culture. And I think it's a really interesting part of translation to understand like what it means to bring in different storytelling traditions and different discourses and different even rhythms of storytelling into English, you know.
Thank you. We do like our signposts and our landmarks, don't we, in the English language? Jen, do you feel the same with German, or are there certain things that just don't work when going from German to English, or are they fairly similar as like Germans, as cousins, as the old English word German means?
Yeah, I think I'm very similar. I think that you know, it really comes down to voice and style, and I find it really interesting and really thrilling the more kind of unusual the style or the voices, and I get excited that will then enter into English and widen the possibilities. And I think as well, I'm somebody that really enjoys reading and writing surreal, experimental, hybrid texts. So and then I ended up kind of doing a string of quite unusually surreal, experimental German translations. So it doesn't really faze me, and I also know that there's a readership for everything, and I think it also plays into expectations, and things like the paratextual material of a translation is where you can set up the expectation of the reader. So I think there's only really an issue with really new, unusual, or seemingly unusual styles or voices if the reader is expecting something completely different. And I think that's where all of that can go into the marketing and the ways that a reader will be introduced to the writer in general. And, you know, the translation has to be as complex and fantastic as you find it in the original. So, you know, I would never simplify or make more obvious the writing of a German language author. There are mechanisms that you can go through, because again, when you talk about tolerances, you know, this idea of even that sometimes things that seem quite natural and obvious and habitual in German can actually be helped by making slight changes to do with punctuation or breaking sentences. And again, when it's part of a style, but you can also say, you know, if every single sentence is incredibly long, that is definitely going to be part of the style, and you can't just chop and change the rhythm of a text. But there are ways that you can help a translation by making certain slight changes which you feel might actually be more fitting for the text because of what is available in English that you can do in English that maybe you can't do in German. So, you know, if I might have read a text that is equally experimental and have noticed a certain way of using punctuation or phrasing, or even things like layout, and then you can use that as a tool to actually help with the translation. So again, it's the importance of reading a huge variety of text to help you, so that you don't get into this thing of like, oh, this is an experimental text, so they'll all sound the same. You have to really take each text as it comes and not be tempted to do any smoothing out or kind of normalizing. But I think it's important that the reader knows what to expect, so that when they go in, they're on board. Because if you give the false expectation that, you know, oh, you know, this is the next Sally Rooney, but translated from German, and actually it's nothing like that, and it's been based on, say, theme or broad assumptions around what a book is, then that's where the problem will lie, when the reader then meets a text that is nothing like those things. So you have to keep the text as specific and unique as possible.
Thank you. Mina, are there sort of things in Tamil that can't be achieved or attempted in English, or there tolerances in the Tamil language which don't work in English?
Oh no, that's an interesting question. No, I think that as the earlier speaker said, there's all of these questions of style and experimentation, and I can speak on the limited area of what I translated. So, for instance, there's a lot of colorful usage of a very idiomatic expressions or very flavorful expressions. And then the question is, how do you make it like what is colloquial in your language? How do you make it colloquial in the English translation? So I think that's this is slightly very interesting issue, because sometimes when people, like for instance, when women write very vulgar, like so-called quote unquote vulgar, or what is seen as immodest or transgressive stuff, then there's always the tendency, for instance, in English, there's a certain shock value about it. And I know this also as a poet, like you use a word like cunt in a poem and people are shocked. But the thing is, a lot of people would use these type of words in Tamil not because to kind of to gain a certain space, like to say that we are women talking about our bodies, or to just say that okay, our mothers, like for instance in Salma's novel, in Salma's novel we have this woman who is very devout. She prays 5 times a day, and she's very, very religious, does everything according to what it's about a small Tamil Muslim community. And then one day she learns from somebody that her daughter's husband is now roaming around town with his second wife, and she's so angry. And then she swears to Allah, and she says, you have to punish this man, this stupid cunt son. So the thing is, on the one hand, there's the juxtaposition of her making an entreaty to God, and at the same way, when she talks to God, she doesn't censor herself, she doesn't use poet things. So I think these type of things are very native to Tamil, like very colorful expressions. And I think sometimes when a lot of editors do this gatekeeping, thinking that it would be just too outrageous for English, or it would be too coarse, or this is not the kind of thing that we would expect from Tamil translation. So I think this kind of cultural baggage is sometimes, I wouldn't say it's impossible to translate. I don't believe in that. I just think that it can slightly be it would just look out of place. But I think these stories do happen out of place. They are not stories that are happening in the so-called, it doesn't happen in Europe, or it might happen within the immigrant communities of Europe. So I think this is we have to normalize them. We just cannot, as a translator, my decision is retain the text, retain all its color, retain all its flavor, retain all the anger of the women, retain all the coarseness with which they speak, because these are real people, just because they go into another language, we just cannot make them polite. We just cannot make them different people. We just cannot. So the thing is that we cannot make them behave like English people because you're writing in English, So, and I think you can understand what I mean, So, so I think, yeah, these are things that for me as a writer, I feel the question of, culture does come inside this way.
Thank you. Absolutely. We've only got time really for one last question. It's been great. It's been wonderful hearing from all your different perspectives. I guess the last question should be for those people out there who are watching who are both writers and translators, or they're one and they're thinking about being the other. What advice would you give them in terms of their own careers and their own writing? Are there any do's and don'ts? Or anything that you would warn them about?
I have a very sort of like practical thought, I suppose. I mean, translation is the only career that I've had that is like entirely supportive of my pace and writer brain. So I really, really cherish my translation career for that practical reason as a writer. And one of the things, and this is not so much advice, but one of the things that I bump up against is because my primary income is translation, I have like quite a high production of books that come out in translation, and a low production of books of my own. I'm also a slow writer. And I don't tend to have short stories lying around and that kind of thing. Like I work on kind of like one big project at a time. And so just in terms of like inhabiting my day to day and, you know, holding on to that sense of, even if I haven't published a novel or a book or an essay in X amount of time, I'm still a writer. I try to be just, I guess, really kind to myself in terms of understanding what my production is as a translator and how that differs from my life as a writer. And also on a practical level, that means that every once in a while, I guess this is a practical tip, every once in a while, I kind of take stock. I'm like, oh, I've done a ton of like translation stuff. Maybe I should think about writing a short story just to address the writer side of me. So I don't forget, because I feel like there's just so much stuff and so much noise. It can be easy to forget where we are and what we're doing, and to compare yourself to other people and other people's progress. So yeah, so I try to be kind of mindful of how much I'm doing for my writer self and how much I'm doing for my translator self, even though they're not in competition and one isn't better than the other, you know.
Brilliant, thank you. Jen or Mina?
I just wanted to add, if you're a translator and you're thinking about starting writing, or a writer that's trying to get into translation, I would say just go for it. You can start translating or writing today, like right now. You don't have to be scared of making that jump. If you want to translate something, you can take a book off the shelf now and try and translate the first paragraph. If you have never written before, just look out the window and write about what you can see out the window. You don't need permission from anybody. You don't have to rush into publishing any of it. You can keep it to yourself, or you can try and do it with somebody else and partner up. I think that can also be a really fantastic approach of getting feedback. And you'll learn so much from doing the other practice. You know, being a translator teaches you so much about different writing styles, about paying really close attention to every single word, every single sentence. And, you know, it's just, it all feeds into one another. The more you write your own work, it'll also tell you when you're translating, when it is you as well. I like writing and seeing how different I am from the writers that I translate. And writing feeds into the quality of my translations. And also read everything, you know, read in the languages that you can read in, that you're interested in translating, and read just everything that you can in the language that you're translating into. That's really, really important.
Thank you. Mina?
Yeah, sorry. I think both Saskia and Jen have been really, really great points. I think I feel what Saskia feels, but I also feel like, yeah, sometimes the fact is, you know, I've done like a dozen books of translation, and I've done only like 3 novels of my own. So you do feel guilty towards yourself. Like, you know, sometimes you think, what if I had not translated the others? What if I had spent the time in, you know, building my own career, or, you know, having my own, what do you call, is that what you call a bibliography or something? I don't know what's the word for that. Yeah, whatever is my own published thing. But then, you know, even for the limited amount of writing that I do, people call me prolific, and I want to go and hide because I'm not prolific. I write so less. I'm translating all the others all the time. So that's one of the things. But actually, in terms of advice, no, I just really felt very deep when she said that, you know, because once you start comparing each part of yourself, I think it's very stressful. You can't find peace. But one of the greatest things I want to say, for if you're a translator trying to write, or a writer trying to translate, I think translation breaks down this big myth that writing needs to be inspired. So you sit with a book and then you're going to translate. You don't need some, you know, massive inspiration. One sentence doesn't work, you leave a blank, you go to the next sentence. And I think that kind of steady consistency, that basically in a course language, gluing your ass to a chair, gluing your ass to the bed, or wherever, just staying in one place and, you know, just plodding through. I think that discipline, and I think discipline is very important, and it's more important the more experimental you are. So I think that kind of discipline really comes from translation. This is something they cannot teach you in a school. This is something you don't get except by actually doing the work. And I think please, like, even if you don't ever want to publish your translations or be a translator, learn this discipline from, you know, the life of translators. It will benefit you immensely as a writer, because I think often as a writer, you know, I spend a lot of your time thinking, oh, where's my inspiration coming from? Is this sentence beautiful? I think that, you know, you shatter that myth.
Brilliant.
That's such a good point.
Glue your ass to the chair. Great advice. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us today. There is one more workshop this afternoon, but otherwise that's the end of this year's Manchester in Translation. We will hopefully be returning again next year with an expanded program. But for now, please join me in thanking today's fantastic guests, Saskia, Mina, and Jen.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, all of you.